Ross Moore entered his brother's home, three things made his blood run cold. The deafening silence that filled every room. 8 bodies arranged like they were sleeping, their faces unrecognizable. A bloody axe, partly clean, leaning against the wall as if waiting to be used again. Around 7 a.m. on Monday, June 10th, the Moore's neighbor Mary Peckham noticed that the house was eerily quiet. She saw no one leave for chores, and the house seemed still. Mary knocked, no answer. She tried opening the door, it was locked. Worried, she called Josiah's brother Ross Moore, who brought his own key. When Ross opened the door and stepped into the front parlor, the smell hit him instantly. It was thick, metallic, and unmistakable blood. He walked through the home and stopped dead in his tracks when he reached the guest bedroom. There he saw two things that no human should ever see. He was completely shocked by what he saw. He ran outside and called the authorities. To understand this part, we will have to talk about what happened inside that house the night before. What turned a quiet, loving home into a gruesome crime scene that would haunt the town of Villisca forever. On the night of June 9, 1912, the Moore family, Josiah, his wife Sarah, and their 4 children had spent a pleasant evening at the local Presbyterian church. It was Children's Day and the kids had performed in a program. With them were 2 overnight guests, Lena and Ina Stellinger, young sisters who had been invited to sleep over after the event. By 10 p.m., the family had returned home, unaware that someone was already inside, or perhaps someone came in after they were asleep. Authorities later determined that the killer or killers had hidden in the attic, based on indentations in the dust on a partly eaten piece of bacon found there. Whether the murderer entered before the family arrived or snuck in afterward, one thing is clear. They waited for the house to fall into silence, waited for the lamps to dim, waited for the breathing to slow. And then, sometime after midnight, the horror began. Each member of the Moore family was bludgeoned to death with Josiah's own axe. The blows were savage, deliberate, faces were unrecognizable. In the guest room, Lena and Ina Stillinger met the same fate, but something was different. Lena in particular appeared to have fought back. Her nightgown was pushed up and her body was found twisted in an unnatural position. There were signs, unspoken, sickening of a darker motive. Sheets had been placed over the bodies, mirrors were covered, even the axe was left leaning against the wall, partly wiped clean, as if the killer felt no need to hide what they had done. But who could do something like this and why? Now let's go back to the moment Ross Moore stood in that hallway, the metallic scent of blood thick in his nostrils, staring into the darkness of a house that would never feel like home again. Ross Moore's heart pounded in his chest as he backed away from the guest bedroom door. His face had gone pale. What he had seen in that room, the mangled bodies of Stillinger girls, was more than the mind could process. Their small forms lay twisted and lifeless in their beds, and the white sheets stained deep red. It didn't look real. It looked like something out of a nightmare. His hands trembling, Ross stumbled out into the porch and called for help. Soon Marshal Henry Hank Horton arrived. He had been on the force for years, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to walk into. Horton stepped cautiously into the Moore home, his boots thudding softly against the wooden floor. The air inside was heavy, it clung to his lungs. As he made his way through the house, he found the same horrifying scene repeated in room after room. First Josiah and Sarah Moore, their bodies still in bed, brutally struck with the blunt end of the axe. Josiah had been hit so hard his skull was split open. He was nearly unrecognizable. Blood had sprayed the ceiling, the walls, the lamp on the bedside table. Sarah had fared no better. The killer had used the axe with a fury that suggested rage or madness. In the next room, the four more children lay dead in their beds. Each child had been attacked in their sleep. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and little Paul. Their small faces had been covered post-mortem, as if the murderer couldn't bear to look at what they had done. On the floor beside one of the beds lay a piece of raw bacon, wrapped in cloth. Nearby was a basin of bloody water. The killer had washed up. Then finally the guest room. The room Ross couldn't bring himself to re-enter. Horton opened the door and froze. Lena and Ina, the girls, had clearly suffered. Lena's hand was laying on the top of her pillow, fingers curled as if she had woken up at the last moment and tried to protect herself. A defensive wound was visible on her arm. Her night dress was pulled up, her undergarments missing. There was no question this murder was personal. It was deranged. The entire house was a slaughterhouse. Yet eerily nothing was stolen. There was money left in plain sight, jewelry untouched, no signs of forced entry. Every clock in the house had stopped at midnight. Someone had been inside that home, had waited for the family to fall asleep, and then methodically, silently executed them one by one. Word of massacre spread fast. By midnight, hundreds of town people had gathered outside the Moore home, and unbelievably some even entered, trampling the scene, staring at the bodies, touching the axe. The crime scene was contaminated before any proper investigation could begin, and in the chaos, the killer had already vanished into the morning fog. But who was it? Was it Frank Fernando Jones, a prominent businessman with a deep grudge against Josiah Moore? Or perhaps a transient killer, someone who rode the train into town that night and disappeared just as quickly? Or could it have been someone much darker, like Reverend George Cayley, the traveling preacher who confessed and then took it back? By the time law enforcement realized the scene had been compromised, it was too late. Dozens of town people had walked through the house. Some even took a piece of Josiah Moore's skull as a souvenir. Blood-soaked bedding was touched. Fingerprints were smudged or wiped away. In the first crucial day, Villisca lost its chance at justice, but the hunt for the killer had begun. Many locals pointed fingers at Frank Fernando Jones. Josiah had once worked for Jones in his implement business, but he left under tense circumstances, taking a Major John Deere account with him when he started his own store. It was an act of betrayal that Jones never forgave. Rumors swirled. Some whispered that Jones had hired a man named William Blackie Mansfield, a known criminal with a history of axe murders, to kill Josiah and his family in revenge. But despite being questioned, Mansfield had an alibi, train records, and witness statements that placed him elsewhere. No charges stuck. Then came the preacher, Reverend George Cayley. George Cayley was a traveling minister, eccentric and deeply unstable, small, soft-spoken, and peculiar. He had been at the Children's Day service the Moore attended that night. Strangely, he left town early the next morning before the bodies were discovered. In the months that followed, Cayley sent bizarre letters to the police, to investigators, even to family members of the victims. He seemed obsessed with the case. Then in 1917, Cayley confessed. He claimed God had whispered to him, told him to slay utterly. He said he couldn't sleep that night and walked past the Moore home, then entered and murdered everyone inside. But Cayley's confession was riddled with inconsistencies. He recanted it almost immediately, claiming he was coerced during interrogation. Still, he was arrested and brought to trial. In 1917, Reverend Cayley stood in a crowded courtroom. The evidence was weak, relying mostly on his confession, which many consider unreliable. The defense argued that Cayley was mentally ill, prone to delusions, and desperate for attention. The prosecution couldn't provide physical evidence tying him to the scene. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second full acquittal. George Cayley walked free. Over the year, other names surfaced. A drifter with a bloodied ox spotted boarding a train that morning. A serial killer roaming the Midwest known to use axes and cover mirrors. A copycat murderer. Yet no one was ever definitely tied to the crime. The Morehouse still stands, restored and preserved. It is now a museum and a destination for ghost hunters. Visitors report whispers in the attic, footsteps on the stairs, children's voices in the darkness. Some say the house itself remembers what happened. Lights flicker, doors open by themselves. Psychics say the spirits are restless, not because they were killed, but because they were never avenged. More than a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of the America's most chilling unsolved crimes. 8 lives were taken in silence, and the killer simply vanished, leaving only blood, questions, and a town that would never forget. So you are an investigator and your life depends on solving this case. Who is the killer and why he did that?